So I had a little bit of a seminal moment last week that I didn't even know, and it's kind of connected to how I got here. I was Mike Christakis, is the Vice President of Student Affairs at the University of Albany, invited me to come do what I knew it was going to be my last campus visit as president.
Mm.
And as I was on the plane, I mean, I should have known this. I kind of did in the back of my head. I understood that, realized, okay, literally 50 years ago, I started at the University of Albany as a freshman. That was where I did my undergraduate work. So there was sort of like a nice sort of like bookend, just having started at Albany and kind of finishing with my last campus visit.
Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Keith Edwards. Today, I'm joined by NASPA President Kevin Kruger. Kevin has a long career as a student affairs leader and leading NASPA. In this role, he's been able to observe the changes in students, student affairs, and student affairs leadership over decades. I'm excited to learn from Kevin as he looks back at his journey and our profession. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and online learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find details about this episode or browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com. This episode is sponsored by Leadershape. Go to leadershape.org to learn how they can work with you to create a just, caring, and thriving world. This episode is also sponsored by Huron, a global professional services firm that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a speaker, author, and coach, helping higher ed leaders empower transformation for a better tomorrow, particularly around leadership, learning, and equity. You can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. And I'm recording this from my home in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the intersections of the ancestral and current homelands of both the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples. Let's get to the conversation. Kevin, thank you for being here, and thank you for
Great to be
joining
here.
us. Let's just begin. Tell us a little bit about you, and as you coming to the end of this career and role, a little bit about your journey and how you got here.
Great, thanks, Keith, and thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of your podcast, and it's been a nice way to see a lot of different folks reflect on the issues in higher ed. So thanks for your work on this. So I had a little bit of a seminal moment last week that I didn't even know, and it's kind of connected to how I got here. I was Mike Christakis, is the Vice President of Student Affairs at the University of Albany, invited me to come do what I knew it was going to be my last campus visit as president. And as I was on the plane, I mean, I should have known this. I kind of did in the back of my head. I understood that, realized, okay, literally 50 years ago, I started at the University of Albany as a freshman. That was where I did my undergraduate work. So there was sort of like a nice sort of like bookend, just having started at Albany and kind of finishing with my last campus visit. My experience at Albany was great. I was a first generation student, so and a low income student. So I was looking at ways to pay for college. And lots of different stories about that, but the one that's related to your question is after having been 2 years in residence hall, I applied to be an RA and served as an RA for 2 years, and then also an orientation advisor. I wanted to be, or at least I thought I did. I wanted to be a social studies teacher. So I was a history political science major, and I got my social studies education certification. Did my student teaching at Clinton High School up in Albany. While I enjoyed the teaching, I didn't enjoy being a teacher. In fact, I didn't like it at all. And I was sort of stuck, right? I mean, here I am in my senior year. This is what I'm supposed to do. If I don't do that, I don't know what I was going to do with a history and political science major. And I had then what is the pivotal conversation that I think many people in student affairs have had in their career is I had somebody who was my supervisor at that point. His name was Lenny Travaglione. He was the hall director for the building I was in. And I said, Lenny, how do you do what you do? Because I just wasn't even paying attention. I didn't know it was a career. We didn't have things like Careers in Student Affairs Month and things like that back then. And he's like, well, this is a profession, and you got to go to grad school. And he told me, listed a bunch of programs that I could have gone to. And that was the kind of the boost to get me to think about something different. And I applied to a bunch of programs. I ended up choosing the University of Maryland for really well-researched and scientific method. At that time, the woman that I was dating, she was going to go to get her master's in library science at Catholic University.
Mhm.
Catholic University, University of Maryland, pretty close. Oh, I'm going to go to Maryland. That's how I decided to go to the University of Maryland. Parenthetically, that's the same person broke up with me the last day of classes, so I ended up going to Maryland for not the same reason, but it worked out.
Yeah.
And really, then from that point forward, once I got to Maryland, which it was a journey that very quickly for me was about becoming a vice president of student affairs. That was very quickly what I wanted to do. I met the VP for student affairs. His name was Bud Thomas. Met some of the student leaders, and I was on that journey. And what I began to do was think about how do I craft a career that would position me to be a VP for student affairs. Now, back then, Keith, you would know that the pathway to a vice president then was you had to go through Res Life. That was the only way you got that job. Now, of course, there's 15 different pathways. But so I started in Res Life, worked for a legend, Denny Roberts, at the Methodist University, and then worked in student activities. And I was the SGA advisor back at Maryland, and worked in admissions and a variety of other roles. And I was trying to kind of cobble all this together. Got my PhD along the way at Maryland with some other legends like Lee Knafelkamp and Susan Comovies and Marilyn McEwen. So, these really great people who I got to be around. And was then the Associate Vice President of Student Affairs, Dean of Students at UMBC. So I was on my track to become a VP, and was involved in professional associations, largely ACPA. I was involved in commissions, had done some convention work with ACPA and legal arrangements chair, a variety of other things. And then Liz Nuss, now the connection from Maryland, she was at that time the executive director of NASPA. She called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to apply for this assistant executive director job?" And I'm like, that's okay now. I had some other people I would recommend, but I'm not interested. She's like, why don't you at least take the train down to DC and talk to me, which is what happened. So I took the train down, and then after a 2-hour conversation, I was really energized with the idea of working on issues not at a campus level, but more broadly than that. And so fast forward, I said, I'll take the job. It was offered to me, and thought, well, this would help me be a better vice president because I have that kind of broader view. And I told her very explicitly, I will do this for 2 years, then I'm going to go back to a campus. Well, fast forward, on June 30th of this year is my 30-year anniversary with NASPA. So you see how that 2-year thing worked out.
Your plans are great.
Yeah. But Keith, what kept me in this work was really two things. One is the association world is very entrepreneurial. It's very much more, while we are nonprofits, we function as kind of profit oriented in terms of being a successful organization. But I have this intellectual curiosity about what's happening in the world and what's happening in higher ed, and thinking about being in a position to influence or guide or help a profession to address those issues became the thing that kind of kept me committed. And I stayed with it. And then I've had the unbelievable privilege the last 12 years of being president and CEO, a job I never thought I would ever have. I mean, didn't even aspire to it because it was so far out of reach. And that's kind of my journey. So 30 years at NASPA, 45 years in the profession, coming to a close on June 30th, and then last 12 as NASPA president. I've had a blessed career, and I mentioned some of the names that along the way, and I could mention others. Gwen Dungy, of course, the previous executive director of NASPA. Other folks at Maryland, because it really, one of the blessings of this field, I know this, is the relationships you establish and the ways in which people help promote other folks. I've been just so fortunate to have so many, good mentors who have helped me be successful. And even to this day, I mean, when you run an organization like NASPA, you can't all be in your head. You have to connect with other people. And so, all the tens and tens and tens of people that you connect with that help you be successful in the work that you do.
Yeah. Well, I can't help but indulge in the similarities in our journey. A very poor kid, went to a college, history major, social studies teacher, student taught. I loved it, but then I had this, well, maybe I'll just dabble in the student affairs thing, and away we go. And then
away you go. Yeah, that's cool.
And then we crossed over at Maryland. We were saying
Yep.
that
Yeah.
almost 20 years ago-ish, you came into a class and talked about trends in
Uh-huh.
student affairs and
Uh-huh.
higher
Yeah.
education when
Yeah.
you were in
Uh-huh.
the assistant executive director role. And yeah, and then so many things. And then, we both share this role of this multiple campus perspective and seeing
Hmm.
these trends and seeing
Yeah.
um, what's similar campus to campus to campus. And I find it often reassuring because people think, what's wrong with us? What's wrong with, what are we doing
Yeah.
wrong? Oh, no, everybody's struggling with that. And then also, I think sometimes people don't really see their points of pride because it's just what we do here, right? They take
Yeah.
it for granted.
Right.
You can say, wow, that
Yeah.
is really
Yeah.
remarkable. It is really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. For sure.
but I want to talk a little bit about some of these broader things in the field. But as you mentioned, it's been a long tenure at NASPA in multiple roles. Um, I'd love to hear how you've seen the association shift and change over that time. Uh,
Yeah.
you're kind of the curator now, right? You were the young buck at one time, and now you're kind of the
Hmm.
curator of this long metric of time and some of the folks that you mentioned along the way.
Yeah. Um, you know, this one, I think one there's two answers to that question. One is just scale. When I started, we had like 7 staff, and uh, we did a conference that was pretty small, an annual conference. We had a program for vice presidents. We had a journal, and then one teleconference where we literally beamed a program up to to campuses. Um, and we largely served at that time vice presidents who were largely white men. It was a pretty small, narrowly focused organization. Fast forward, we're a $24 million organization. We have 15,000 members. We represent student affairs, which also now is the most diverse sector of higher ed, right? So NASPA reflects that diversity as well. So it's just, a lot of it's just scale. I think the biggest change has been NASPA, as well as other associations, have kept pace with the amazing changes that have occurred in the field, right? That over the last 30 years. I say this in some of my speeches, and I get a head nod from everybody in the audience, but forget about 30 years. Even if I just said to you or anybody else in this field, particularly someone who's been worked over the last 10 years, what we do today is qualitatively different than what we did 10 years ago in some ways that make the work very different. And I think that is, I think NASPA is reflective of that. I mean, the issues we were tracking in 30 years. I mean, it's interesting. When we had our 100-year anniversary, just like ACPA just had this year, I went back to the journals that back in the founding of NASPA, like in the early 1900s, and I had this thing where I listed out the 12 issues that were talked about. I did like a content analysis of the journal at the time and the conferences at the time, and then I read those without the date attached, and of course, a lot of them are the same, right? I mean, the same issues, right? But the ways in which we think about them are just completely different. And I think our associations have all tracked that to some degree. NASPA, again, used to be a focus on vice presidents. Now, vice presidents are are important, but small part of our members. Mid-level professionals are the largest piece, grad students. The AVP role, which largely existed but has expanded dramatically over the past decade and a half or so. Grad faculty, so the association has grown in that regard a little bit. I think the thing that the other change that I think we've seen, certainly I've seen, and maybe reflects a little bit about what I didn't understand when I became president of NASPA, was the extent to which the media in particular, but also college presidents and other associations would look to me as one of the key voices of the field. And I never thought about that I had a megaphone, and I think that I've said this a couple of times that, my belief is, with the privilege that comes with being president, I should own the opportunity then to speak out on issues that are important to the field, to students, to higher ed. And so I had my metaphors. When I took the job, there was a megaphone sitting on my desk, and you can either pick it up or not. And I think that I wanted to pick it up because I thought there were things that we could say that would advance the field, but also advance the work we do with students. So as a result, I'm I've been on Dateline and NBC News and all these kinds of things, which is not about me, but about the issues that we get to talk about, which I think has been pretty unique opportunity. So anyway,
Mhm.
that's what I've seen over the years, and so it's a real pleasure to be in the association community, and to work with all the student affairs associations,
Mhm.
which are play also super critical roles in our field, and to be amongst with other colleagues and other associations that are working on some of these really difficult issues that we're trying to struggle with in higher ed.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great look back, and the massive scale up and the opportunity, and then also the responsibility that comes with that megaphone, right? You gotta be real careful what
Yeah.
you say into that megaphone, because it's a leveraged position, right? It makes
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. When you say things, and you have a perspective, then you also have to be willing to take the heat that comes with that,
Mhm.
right? Because not
Mhm.
everybody's always going to agree with you. And a piece of advice that I got early on, which is not surprising for anybody who speaks a lot, is don't read the comments. So again, if I'm quoted in Inside Higher Ed or the Chronicle or Washington Post, New York Times, whatever, I don't read the online comments because
Mhm.
they'll just debilitate you. They'll just wear you down from the sometimes the meanness, but the way other people might view what you have to say. Look, you and I are in the same space, but most of the people listening to this are in the same space.
Mhm.
We have a generally progressive human dignity viewpoint on the world. And for people who find that to be bothersome, it's difficult to hear that voice. So it's one of
Yeah,
those things you kind of have to kind of put aside a little bit.
yeah. I'm reminded of Brene Brown reading some of the comments
Mm,
after her massive TED talk and
mm,
having a panic attack.
yeah.
Which is what led her to that Theodore Roosevelt quote about the man in the arena, which she then framed
Hmm.
and put on her wall and kind of shifted her
Yeah.
whole perspective. And
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
I did my
Yeah.
TEDx talk, I asked a good friend, I said, I need you to read the comments because I won't. And if there's anything there that's helpful feedback, let me know, or that I need to
Right.
respond to, let me know. And otherwise, I'll just ignore it. And
I did the same thing. My communications folks on my team, they will read the comments, and
yep,
they'll alert me to anything that really needs some attention because you don't want to ignore them, right? I mean, so there might be
yes,
something in there that from a customer service or something needs responding, and then
yeah,
but then again, this is just a little sidetrack here, but for anybody who's in this position. So I never then engage with people online in that regard because that's a losing proposition. But I
yeah,
will call people. I mean, I've had
mhm,
many people who disagree with me, and I'm happy to call them or say, call me, and then set up a call and just and have a conversation, but not to play that out in an online
yeah,
environment, which is I think not sometimes what people want when they're making that kind of critique.
yeah, absolutely. Good wisdom, good wise advice is I think we're all playing in a more public realm
Yeah.
and field with
Hmm.
social media and
Right.
YouTube, and even if we think it's a conversation at a town hall on campus, we have to assume someone's filming it with their phone and it was going to share it
Yeah.
to others. And
Keith,
how
I
do
think
we keep
that's
that in
yeah.
mind?
I've talked to a bunch of folks recently about over the last year or two about that. I think the fact that you're not maybe being recorded, you are being recorded. That's a different kind of valence on what how you do this job.
Yeah.
It's not you're not in the privacy or the protective environment of a group of students that you're working with or a town, like I say, a town hall kind of thing.
Mhm.
The fact that it can immediately go public and then you can be evaluated or critiqued by more than just your community is, I think it changes the work a lot.
Yeah.
I think it makes people, our members, or people in the field a lot more cautious about what they say. I don't think that's a good thing.
Hmm.
But it almost means that like, anybody who's in a senior role, AVP, director, MVP, I mean, everybody needs some communications training,
Yeah.
because of the fact that you are essentially in the public eye as soon as you step foot in an audience. And look at those folks at UT Austin, who were kind of tricked into talking about their DEI efforts.
Yeah.
And that kind of really, in some ways, led to the dissolution of those departments by the legislators. So I mean, I think it's a different world today in that regard.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, let's talk about how other ways it's a different world.
Hmm.
You've had this decades long macro experience. As you said, you have this rich curiosity for the trends. I know you pay attention to trends in students, in the issues, in media, politics, and their effect on campus. And then you also have been in this role of sort of a objective advisor to many student affairs leaders, someone who doesn't report to them, who isn't a competitor for the next job or that thing or their president or their board, but sort of has this macro view. I'd love to hear from you. What have you seen shift in your time around students, around student affairs and student affairs leadership?
And I'm gonna share some things. None of them will come as a surprise. These are all, I mean, you'll be like, yeah. But there's some of them are pretty tectonic in terms of the changes. Because at one level, the work that we do individually with students today is the same as we were doing 30 years ago. I mean, or 45 years ago when I first started. I mean, there's the work of student affairs and the value system of student affairs fundamentally is pretty similar. But there's so many big changes that are embedded in beyond that. So here's the one that I have given a lot of thought to, given my own background from the University of Maryland, which was a program when I started in 1978, which was one of the number of programs in the country that were based on what was called at the time student development theory. Now, anybody who studies student development theory at the time knows that most of those theories were developed on white middle-class students. That's sort of an aside, but at the time that was not part of the conversation. And so student development, and so the idea of taking human development and morphing that into a notion of how students progress developmentally was really the foundation of our field. I do remember though when I started SMU as an area coordinator, and I brought my Maryland briefcase of student development theory with me, metaphorically, and I started talking at that time I was 22 probably, whatever. I was so enthusiastic about how you use student development theory, and I remember the director of housing at the time at SMU was like, "Whoa, put that down. We have work to do here. We don't talk we don't talk in developmental theory language. We just do the work." It was sort of like a wake-up call. But in any case, student development theory. And then, Keith, you'll remember, folks began talking about student learning. And we had the student learning imperative, and we had learning to be considered and documents like that. And this whole idea which we kind of always knew, that we were part of the learning and enterprise of the institution, but we wanted to articulate that in a little more clear way with learning domains and the like. Interestingly, that got us a little afoul of the faculty component of the institution, because faculty always said, "Hey, we're the ones who do learning. You do this other thing." And there was some chafing around that time, and that I think was part of our journey over that period of time in the 2000s, of sorts. Well, and then fast forward, what do we talk about today? Every single day, student success. We don't talk about student development as much. It's there in our programs. We talk about learning, but student success is really an organizing structure that we see, that's sort of swept across the country. Interestingly, Learning We Considered, which is 20-year anniversary, is this year.
I hadn't made that connection.
We did some work on that, and they're actually putting out kind of not a revised student learning, but we just sort of did some reflective work on it. But
that makes me feel old, because I remember editing with Susan Kovovich drafts and providing feedback of the earlier version. And that document, I think, really shifted my perspective as a student affairs professional profoundly.
Well, it holds up too. Because of this, I've reread it, and it does hold up. But here's an interesting thing: if you do a word search on the document, the word student success is mentioned one time in the entire document. And I think it's just an example of the evolution of language, right? The work may be similar, but I think the focus on student success, I think, for me, is one of the more critical evolutions for us as a field. Because when you unpack student success, for me, it becomes very closely linked to the equity agenda for higher education, and the reality that we have been fairly unsuccessful in closing historic attainment gaps for Black students, Latinx, Hispanic, Latino students, some are Indigenous students, some portions of the API community, low-income students, first-gen students. I mean, roughly their attainment rates are about half of their peers. And that has been pretty sticky over the last couple of decades. It's only now that we sort of see the moral imperative, within the last 5, 7 years to make some changes in that space and to try to do something to address that. And I think, so that's a pretty big change, I think, for us as a profession, and one that I think resonates with college presidents and provosts, and I think provides, for me, we talk about student affairs, academic collaboration, since for the last 45 years, but we've had a hard time figuring out how to do that. Student success is the organizing structure around how we do that, because you cannot have a successful student success agenda without collaboration between those two entities. I mentioned equity. I think the other evolution is, in language, but also in purpose and intent. Back in 30 years ago, we talked a lot about multicultural programs, multiculturalism, then kind of morphed a little bit into diversity. And that's really been over the last maybe 5, 7, 10 years or so that we have been more articulate about diversity, equity, inclusion, of course, now belonging is a big piece of that, justice, social justice. I mean, those concepts, I think, are places where we've seen some real evolution. Just a quick NASPA story, and this won't come as a surprise to those of you who have followed the association journeys in the field. ACP always led in this space. I remember a conversation at a board meeting where we were doing a new strategic plan, and there was a very robust conversation about whether social justice as a concept should be in the strategic plan as a goal, or should it be something that kind of runs through it? And even those two things had not been something you'd have seen in a NASPA strategic plan. And Paulette Daups, who was both an ACP and NASPA person, was on our board, and she really advocated for that inclusion of that language in who we are, because we had been acting in that way, but we hadn't really articulated it in that way. So even that's just a benchmark for me about how we've changed. And now, I think it would you have to kind of reflect now on the political environment of our country, and how DEI work and the anti-DEI legislation is affecting our work, and also the work we do with students and students themselves. It strikes me now that we have two different student affairs professions. One where there's a legislative climate in that state that allows DEI work to flourish, both organizationally as well as programmatically, and one where it's illegal to do the work or not permitted. I don't think we've ever had a time in my career where the core work of who we are as a profession, what we do, has been legislatively denied. And I think that is new. And I think it's a stark reminder. If you're in grad school and you're looking at a job, I mean, there's two different professions that are existing now. And I think that's just one of those, that's a pretty big change. I mean, in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I've never thought about it in that stark of terms, as we have two different student affairs professions happening. And it really resonates with me as I think about conversations that I have with some of the campuses that I work with, where some are saying we cannot lean into DEI enough. As far as we think we go, it's never far enough for our students, for our staff, and we cannot be far. And then others are like, we can't even use those words.
That's right.
And I can't go to the conferences, and I can't enroll in this professional development. But I've never thought about it in the starkness of two different professions. That's really remarkable to think about.
I think that's the other thing that strikes me is that we have always kind of I think believed, certainly, let's say always, let's say in the last 10 years or so, that we are hand in hand with our students in wanting a more equity-based society, whether it be at the institutional level or a society in general. But now, as this rolls out, we see that we are now squeezed between two forces. We have squeezed between, legislators or attorneys or governmental officials who are saying, don't do this or do less of it, and our students who want more of it, actually, which is interesting. Even in these states where we have banned DEI, the students themselves want this to be a part of their educational experience, and that's backed up by every data point you can find. It's the one thing that gives me, Keith, a little hope, because I think that I think that this is a short-lived movement, because as these students become voting age and become influential in their local communities, they will want to reverse this experience, to reverse this trend that we've seen. And so I'm hopeful that maybe, it's not going to be next year, but, in the next 5, 7 years that we may see some new pressures to restore, really what is the dignity of how we work with our students. So,
Yeah.
I may mention a couple of things. Mental health. We've always had mental health. If you look at back in the student personnel point of view, it's in there in language in there. But of course, the mental health crisis that we see amongst this generation is new and unique. And I think one of the things that is two things that have come out of that I think that is really positive. One is the expansion of well-being as an initiative on campus and as a strategy for dealing with mental health. Now, we were talking about well-being. The wellness wheel was around in the 70s.
Yes.
So it's not a new concept, but it is new in terms of how we think about it and organize ourselves around it. I mean, the whole expansion, for example, of the AVP for health, safety, well-being. I mean, that role didn't exist very much a decade ago. So that is one piece. And then the second thing I think, which is the rapid advent through COVID of telecounseling as a modality. So that was something that only 5% of counseling centers had any kind of telecounseling in 2019. Now it's more like 65% and probably growing. And in fact, if you go to a NASPA meeting and maybe some other meetings, if you go to the exhibit hall, it now looks like, it basically looks like a mental health telecounseling exhibit hall. The amount of private equity that's come into that space has really expanded the number of providers. And I think this is a good thing, right? For international students or for students who work full-time or adult students or a variety of other sectors, international students, to provide access through telecounseling allows us to use the resources in the counseling center, the clinical services on site for some of the most severe cases of mental health challenges that we see. So I think that's a pretty big.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many therapists I know who said before COVID, I would never do it. It's unethical. I refuse. I will not.
Exactly.
It has to be in person.
Yeah,
and after they're like, it's half. It's going to be half, and I like it. I like it being half.
Exactly.
So
I think that's a huge change in a very short amount of time. I'll ask let me mention one more, and we'll move on to another question. I've never seen, I don't think you have either, the dissatisfaction of the workforce that we have right now, that we're now facing. Student affairs folks have always understood that they've chosen a profession that isn't the most highly paid in the world, right? So you could have gone you could have gone IBM, Google, whatever it is. You could have done something else, but you choose it because to some extent it's value centric, right? It's something. It's like teaching. I mean, it has that kind of. However, what we have been confronted with over the last 2-3 years is of our own making, and that is we allowed. When I say we, student affairs and student affairs leaders and presidents to some degree, but we allowed salaries to languish in student affairs to the point they became really unsustainable in some places. I mean, where you could have a master's degree and some experience and not even necessarily have a living wage. That maybe your only choice might be to live with and have roommates to afford an apartment. And I think we did that out of a core belief that we had generationally, like certainly my generation and to some extent Gen Xers, that the love of the work was in exchange for the salary, right? And while it's true to some degree, I think we allowed that to evolve in a space where we have a lot of dissatisfaction with pay equity. And so people are leaving for better paying jobs outside the field. And you can't blame them for doing so. And then the second thing is we also have allowed the workday to expand, and that sort of intersects with the salary issue. So my model when I came up was, you work 60, 70 hours a week, you don't get paid anything, but you love the work, and eventually you get paid. This generation doesn't want that, right? They want fair pay. They want a reasonable work hour. If you look at the Coupa HR data, only about a third of folks in student affairs work just the standard hours that you're paid for. That means 2/3 don't. And some of those hours can be pretty expensive. And I think that unpaid labor has become an issue for this profession, for this generation as well. I will note, I think what's important to note that this is not just a student affairs issue. This is across many, many professions. So this is not just us, but we are dealing with it, and we're seeing the impact with the dissatisfaction of the core kind of mid-level professional who are not recommending student affairs the way they used to. Thus, our graduate programs are all suffering. Every one of them are enrollments down. And that is you can call it a canary in the coal mine. You can call it, I actually call it an existential crisis of the profession, because if we are not no longer do we have enough grad students to fill our programs and then fill the jobs that many have taken historically. Are we still a profession if we don't have that kind of core graduate experience? Yeah, granted, not everybody in student affairs has that grad program, so it's never been a requirement. But it has been that pipeline has been a pretty significant part of who we are, and I think it's something for us to think about. How do we? And what's happening, Keith, is I'm sure you've heard the same thing. I still have a job to fill. If I can't get a grad student, a master's level candidate, I'm going to have to hire another master's level candidate from some other discipline, or hire a bachelor's level candidate.
Mm-hmm.
When you start hiring bachelor's level candidates, who's going to train those people to be effective in the complexity of the work?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a challenge I think the profession is going to be facing coming in the near future.
Well, just to reinforce that, I mean, we've done more than 200 episodes, and the number one request we get is episodes on people leaving student affairs adjacent careers, and we've done lots of episodes on that topic, and it is still the thing, the number one request. Folks are just really interested and curious about that. I think the other thing is I see that pipeline issue, and then I also see student affairs professionals who are just sometimes treated awfully by leaders and terribly and pushed out for silly reasons. And then those same leaders are complaining about how they can't hire people.
Yeah,
so
I know.
We've got to tend to
I just want to build on that for a second. So we had a project we did that kind of rolled through COVID a little bit. We call it the Future of Student Affairs Task Force. And so there's the reports available on our website. It's free. But one of the things that we surveyed about 13,000 student affairs professionals. And there was quantitative data, and there was also a qualitative piece. So when there was several questions that were asked about, like, your experience in student affairs. Now, we didn't publish that. We did some factor analysis, but I read every one of the comments. And it was sobering, because what I saw were so many people who were feeling like they were mistreated by their supervisor or the institution, or, I mean, not just a couple, but a lot. And it strikes me that I think that one of the things that we have not emphasized enough is high quality supervision at the director level, assistant director level. We don't teach that in grad school, right? You have to kind of just learn it on the job. And I think you're right. We don't take care of our people in the same way. When we ask people why they were thinking about leaving, so they didn't feel valued by their supervisor or the institution. That should be the easiest thing. I mean, we're the hugging profession, right? We hug everybody. Of all the things, that should be the one thing that we can take pride in, and we're not doing as good a job with it as we should. So I think you're right. If you want to fix the workforce, we need to fix the middle management piece, particular, and at the higher leadership levels too. It's not just middle managers.
Well, I know you have a lot of conversations with senior student affairs officers. I know you're at a lot of campuses. You talked with a lot of people at conferences. I know you're at a lot of events, and I'm sure you have a lot of phone calls and Zoom conversations that no one wants you to talk about. So don't name names, but I'd love the insights that you're gathering from all of these. I'm sort of thinking about, I love talking with college therapists, not about a particular client, but about their caseload. So I'm kind of wondering, what do you learn from all of these conversations with these senior leaders?
Yeah. Well, I think right now, let's get current events. There isn't a single vice president, AVP, or college president I've talked to who isn't struggling with the current activism we see on campus. And it's impossible position that campuses are in. I think that is, so, we've been, you probably had an episode on it. We've been talking about this generation for a few years. This generation we knew was going to be more activist. And frankly, as a student affairs professional, I think that's a good thing. Like, activism should be part of the college experience. Shouldn't we be a place where we can engage in challenging and difficult issues?
Part of the learning.
Exactly. And I think that is happening on many campuses. If you really kind of get past the headlines and the what's actually happening on campus, not the screaming across barriers, but in the classroom and dialogues, you hear there's a lot of positive things that are happening as folks are trying to understand the complexity of this issue. So that's a good thing. What's difficult now as a leader is a couple of things. One is when protests become this inflamed. I think it's important to note, one of the things that is we put student affairs people in harm's way. And I was watching a video, just one small example of a unnamed campus, and it was an incident that took place, and I was looking at the videos I was on YouTube, and there's the barriers and the students on one side screaming and the students on the other side screaming, and there's a space in between. And I look at there, well, there's a assistant vice president, dean of students in a tactical vest with a helmet on, trying to maneuver between some things that were happening in this
Yeah,
particular
they don't
space.
teach that in grad school.
They don't teach that in grad school. They also, by the way, didn't teach young hall directors to put on PPE and deliver meals to quarantine students in a crisis that we didn't even know the impact would be on your own personal health. I mean, we're actually putting student affairs folks in positions that are not commensurate with what we tell people this field is about.
Yeah.
I've had many vice presidents assaulted, vice presidents, AVPs assaulted by the protesters. I mean, physically assaulted. Some are now working from home because they don't feel safe on the campus. That's a very different world. So that is part of the conversation about how to kind of get through this period and what can we do differently. Now, I will tell you, this is a learning profession. So when we had many protests and activism around if you might remember, like in the, maybe say the 2010s or so, where we talked about controversial speakers, there was a lot of, issues going on. We learn how campuses are dealing with this, and so how can we be more effective? How do we, some of it's tactical, very, kind of how do you work with the police? I mean, even whether the police have uniforms on when they're on the front line. I mean, there's lots of different things that can happen. We'll learn from this and try to get better at this, because I think to some degree, I think we're a little caught flat-footed on this crisis. I mean, campus happened so fast. And I don't think that we were prepared for what that meant for our campuses. So that's one thing that people are talking about. I think the other conversation I'm having with campus leaders is about budgets. Everybody knows about the enrollment issues, but even without the enrollment issues alone, we have forces that are pushing against our campuses. Look at the NACUBO data we just released today. So we see tuition discounting now at the highest level it's ever been, but it's been that every year it's highest. It's tracking this way. You keep increasing tuition discounting, it's going to erode your budget integrity to some degree. I think for the next decade, I think there's an understanding, Keith, that we have student affairs is facing a very hard budget period. Fiscal constraints are going to be the word of the day, even for the elite colleges. I think we're going to be looking at fewer resources. That's going to create both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is, how do we rethink the work that we do to serve the key priorities of the division and our students? And the challenge, of course, is going to be, how do we do that? How do we do that? Because we have structures, we have silos that are built into our institutions, and those kind of remove some of the flexibility we might otherwise have to make changes, right? So I think we're going to have to do that. And I think that's a priority. Third thing, which is not really talked about too much yet, but is an understanding of, and that is this generation of students and Gen Alpha behind them are coming to college for very different reasons than previous generations. They are clearly coming for a job and a career and a well-paying job. Some of that's up against the cost of college and financial and the cost issues that exist. So I think we as a enterprise, see a lot of movement in the next 5 years, I think, about how we make a stronger connection between what students are doing in school, college, from the freshman year and even pre-matriculation, to articulating a well thought out career and career path and a connection to the workforce. I think we're going to see a lot more in that space over the next number of years as well. And then, I'm just going to say, I mentioned the workforce. I think we got to repair the workforce. Look, it's not at crisis level, but it's getting there. That's certainly a conversation that I think every leader is dealing with, because most student affairs divisions, they have 17 to 20% vacancies, and they're having a harder time filling them, particularly at the non kind of prestigious institutions, like the elites and some geographical areas. I was at a meeting recently. Yeah, exactly. Regional institutions and small regionals, small colleges and regional spaces. I had a little bit. I was sharing something with an audience of student affairs VPs recently, and I said, well, you might used to get 150 applications for an RD job. Now you're getting like 20, and then somebody said 20. How about one or two? So I think this whole how we manage this workforce crisis is really is going to be a pretty big issue. And I'll just say the last thing. I mentioned it earlier. I think let me just say in 10 years, if we look back at this period and we have not made substantial progress in closing attainment gaps for low-income, first-gen students of color, then we have failed. I'm just going to say it, and shame on us for not having. And I say us, I mean not just student affairs, but higher ed, for not having made progress on this. Because I'm always struck by Anthony Carnevale's report at Georgetown, the separate but unequal, and how already we have, mostly middle-class white students go to, one of the 140, selective institutions in America. And Hispanic, Latinx, Black, Indigenous, low-income students go to more open access institutions. So that we already have sort of two Americas in terms of who gets what, right? But I think that if we don't, it's even worse if we don't close those attainment gaps where the economic opportunities of our country are really shifted towards folks who have privilege already. I think that's a national shame, and I think we are talking about more about it, but I think we should be held accountable for progress in that area in the next 10 years.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. You've spoken about the past, both of decades of NASPA and the student affairs profession, what's happening now, and even prognosticating a little bit in the future. As we are running out of time, we like to end with this final question. The podcast is called Student Affairs Now. We also always like to end with what are you thinking? What are you troubling? Or what are you pondering now? You've spoken to some of that, but as you come up here on concluding this career, I know you'll still be active and engaged. What is really present with you now?
Yeah. I think, I mentioned, I think I'm just going to highlight the things I mentioned. I think workforce is number one. I mentioned these attainment gap issues. I think number two for me. One I didn't mention, I'll just throw out there, as I think this is not for all institutions, but I think we have made so little progress in keeping our students safe in American fraternities in the United States, and I think that is a challenge that we have got to address. We cannot continue to allow fraternities to continue to kill mostly the men on their chapters. And then the last one I think is a hope I have for our country that we will re-embrace equity, diversity, inclusion as a core construct for the future of our country, and start and reverse this sort of I think harmful trend. These are the things that I worry about and I stay up and think about. I don't care Democrat, Republican, but there's core human values that we should all come together on. This is one of them. And America should be about embracing who we are as a country, which in 2040, we will be a minority-majority country. Already, 18 years and younger, anybody 18 years and younger is predominantly of color and non-white. And so that's our country. So we should embrace that, and higher education should be a part of that embracing.
Yeah. Well, I love your prognostications. They make me worried. They give me hope. They give me a sense of urgency. They give me a sense of purpose, and really reinvesting in the work that we do, and the power and the potential and the necessity of it, and to do it well. It has big implications.
Yeah. Urgency, Keith. I like to, that's that word. That was a word I would use, urgency. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Kevin. I really appreciate you taking
Keith.
some time at the end of your time at NASPA to join us and to look back and look forward and offer folks some of your insights. Really appreciate it.
It's been a good conversation. I've enjoyed it. Good luck to you. Thanks again.
Thank you. And thanks to our sponsors for today's episode, LeaderShape and Huron. LeaderShape partners with colleges and universities to create transformational leadership experiences for students and professionals with a focus on creating a more just, caring, and thriving world. LeaderShape offers engaging learning experiences on courageous dialogue, integrity, equity, resilience, and community building. To find out more about LeaderShape or connect with them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And Huron is a professional services firm functioning globally that collaborates with clients to put possible into practice by creating sound strategies, optimizing operations, accelerating digital transformation, and empowering businesses and their people to own their future. By embracing diverse perspectives, encouraging new ideas, and challenging the status quo, Huron creates sustainable results for the organizations they serve. And thanks as always to Nat Ambrosi, who makes us look and sound good behind the scenes. Thank you, Nat. And we love the support of these conversations from you. You can help us reach even more folks by subscribing to the podcast, to YouTube, and our weekly newsletter. Keith Edwards, thanks to our fabulous guest today, Kevin Kruger, and to everyone who is watching and listening. Make it a great week.